Hey, what's up? Welcome to another episode of Wassup Conversations, a podcast with inspiring storytellers across different mediums and crafts. I'm your host, Hamid Reza Nikoufar, and in this episode, my guest is one of the most important people in the history of video game. He's the creator of Karateka and Prince of Persia. Ladies and gentlemen, my legendary guest is no one but Jordan Mechner. Jordan is one of the most celebrated figures of the video game industry and is also a very great writer. Among his books, The Making of Prince of Persia Journals is a holy scripture on game development. His new book, however, is the closest thing we could get to a new Prince of Persia. It's called Samak the Ayyar, A Tale of Ancient Persia. Columbia University Press describes the book as following. The adventures of Samak, a trickster warrior hero of Persia's thousands-year-old oral storytelling tradition, are beloved in Iran. Samak is an Ayyar, a warrior who comes from the common people and embodies the ideals of loyalty, selflessness, and honor. A figure that recalls samurai, ronin, and knights, it is distinctive to Persian legend. His exploits sit against an epic background of palace intrigue, battlefield heroics, and a star-crossed romance between a noble prince and a princess, as are deeply rooted in Persian culture as are the stories of Robin Hood and the King Arthur in the West. However, this majestic tale has remained little known outside Iran. As a Persian, I found this book full of wonders, adventures, and very loyal to the way ancient Persians told the stories. It's available in a paperback, hardcover, and ebook, and you can purchase the book via the links in the description. Jordan and I talked about many different topics, the subject of his new book, Prince of Persia, whether he would make another Prince of Persia or not, Assassin's Creed, and his love for ancient Persian stories. Before we begin, please consider supporting and donating to Wassup Conversations from the link in the description, and also subscribe, like, and turn on the notification bell if you would like to see more conversations like this. You can find out more about Wassup Conversations from my website, nikoufarmusic.com. Alright, let the story begin. Hello and welcome to Wassup Conversations, Jordan. It's so good to have you on the podcast. I was telling my friends that Jordan's made a game about my country and culture before I was even born in it. So this is a huge honor for me. Jordan, what were you during the 2020 and its horrible sequel 2021? Were you productive? How do you handle this end of the world scenario?
Well, I have the great good luck to be in Montpellier in the south of France. You know, if you have to be stuck somewhere for 2 years, this is a very pleasant place to be stuck. And I'm really blessed that I've been able to keep working. You know, I've got a bunch of projects going in different media, but all with collaborators, who, we were able to find ways, sometimes online. And I've got a personal project that I'm able to work on, just, with pen and paper. So I feel very lucky.
Yeah, that's great. So congratulations on your fantastic book, Samak the Ayyar. As Persians would say, Samak the Ayyar. It was released a few weeks ago, but I had the chance to read it some months ago, and I loved it. I guess it was during Persian New Year, and I'd heard this story when I was a kid, but I don't think I'd ever read it as a book. Mostly because it's been transmitted as an oral story, but it's very interesting for me to read it for the first time through the mind of an American and in English. Tell me about the history of the book. How did you find out about it, and what triggered you to sit down and write this very old Persian folk on paper?
Well, I had actually never heard of Samak the Ayyar, until it was a few years ago, and I was actually for what was going to be a new installment in the Prince of Persia series. It was explorations, and that particular project ended up not coming together. But in the research phase, I had some great encounters, and one of them was with Freydun Rasuli, who was he was introduced to me by a mutual friend, as Persian, a painter, a scholar, someone who had translated poetry, and so I just wanted to ask him about the period, the history, the folklore, just to kind of develop my, and the team's concept of the world of Prince of Persia, which, despite having done Prince of Persia games for 30 years, all the way back to the Apple II in the 80s, I've never been to Persia and only know it through literature and so forth. So when I was talking to Rasuli, he went and he took a book down from his shelf and started reading to me just on the fly. The book was in Persian, and he sort of translated it into English as he read. He opened to a page at random, and he started saying something like, and then the Prince of Persia climbed down the ladder, and there was a stone set into the floor, and he pulled the stone away, and there was a ladder. He climbed down the ladder, and I'm like, whoa, wait a minute, you're describing a Prince of Persia level. And so, he read a few other pages, and, there was an evil vizier, there were kings and armies and a beautiful princess. And I'm like, wait a minute, this is the source material that Prince of Persia needs. This is great. I've got to read the whole book. And he says, well, there's 5 volumes. Great. Where can I get one? He's like, it's never been translated. This is it. This archaic Persian book that he was holding in his hands, was out of print since the 1960s. He just said, it's well known in Iran, but it just there's really no proper book of it. So I said, all right, well, whatever happens with this video game, we have to translate it. First of all, because I want to read it.
How did you met Freydun?
We were introduced by a mutual friend who is actually an Iranian martial artist living in Los Angeles. We were both living in Los Angeles at the time. Oh. And, when I started, when I started to think that this new Prince of Persia project, might be coming together, I asked my Persian friends, who should I talk to? Who knows about history of the period? And so, Rasuli was, an amazing contact. And he's an incredibly talented guy. He's a sort of a mystical painter. And, there's many facets to his work and personality. But one thing I'm so grateful for is that, even though whatever happened with, video game project, it was a great experience. It didn't result in a game on the shelves that anybody can play. But it was very enriching, to the team, to me, and out of it came Samak the Ayyar, because we said, well, at least we can continue with this. And we went on, we continued translating, the entire first 5 volumes. And that's, here it is.
Yes. Awesome. I can't wait to get a hard copy of this. I read it on Kindle. Like 3 or 5 pages, you begin the book and it's like, oh my God, he was destined to write this book. It's all about a Prince of Persia. It's exactly that.
I'm kind of curious to ask you, because you said you knew the tales of Samak growing up, like what form were they in? How did you encounter them? Was it just oral storytelling? Was it a...
It wasn't presented to me as a whole story, as a part of it. Like there's this guy, there's that character, and very vaguely, I guess it was also in our books in school or something. I don't remember exactly, but it's always been there. But to see that you kind of combined the whole story together and present it as a book, it was very interesting. And it was the first time for me to read the whole story. And it was crazy to read it in English. But again, the first thing that really resonated with me was the flow and the way the story was carrying me through the events, because it has the exact qualities of an ancient Persian folklore. The simplicity of the narration, short time lapses between the events, and most importantly, the feeling of wonder and being in a relatable but totally different era and location. I'm curious, what's the reaction of people not very familiar with this kind of storytelling, and how did you learn to tell the story this way? It's so close to the heart, so close to the source material.
Really, it was there. I mean, it was the anonymous storytellers who invented this story and created it 1,000 years ago. They did that work. And Rasuli and I worked like this. He would translate it from, not even modern Persian, from the archaic Persian, with a lot of, unfamiliar words and so on. He would translate that into kind of rough English. And so it would take him a week or 2 to do a chapter. He would email it to me. And so it was like a serial. like every week I would get a new episode. And so I would translate it into, a more polished version. And then, we sort of had to edit it a little bit, because one thing about an oral story that's told over a period of years is sometimes something happens and it's like the storyteller doesn't quite remember exactly how he told another part, 20 chapters ago.
Yeah.
It's not like a book where you can kind of back and see, okay, oh wait, these characters already met. So we had to do that kind of editing just to kind of make it all, flow smoothly and be consistently. But, I didn't add any episodes or any characters. It's really all there. I mean, already, when I first read it, in the rough version, I felt this is like it's like an HBO series. It's like Game of Thrones. It's just jumping between these different plot lines. You've got different groups of characters, and the storyteller leaves, Samak and his friends, and then it goes to see what's what the bad guys are doing, and then what the prince is doing, and it's just so well paced. So apart from tweaking it and polishing it, really didn't have to do much.
Yeah, so you kind of are presented the way old Persians were presented the story. So in a bit by bit, because you can't, it's a long story. You can't sit down and listen to the whole thing at once. So it was probably, I don't know, in the street, people were gathered and one guy would come in and narrate the story, and next day and next week, a second part. And exactly as you mentioned, it's like a series. It changes the character. The main character changes. We're going to see different perspectives of this story. And it's very interesting that you kept the same feeling. As if I read the book out loud, it would be exactly something like the oral version, if you can say that, of the story. It was crazy. So, yeah, I think you with Prince of Persia started this sense of curiosity about Persian stories, especially in gaming community. I mean, before that, in the West, people were exposed to Middle Eastern stories, mostly with Aladdin, Thieves of Baghdad, and Arabian Nights, but they were all about Arab literature and culture. But you, with Prince of Persia, introduced Persian tales to the world. I was talking to Petrus Desolé, the creator of Assassin's Creed franchise, and he told me that during his research about Persia, he read this book, Alamut, about Hashashin, and he wanted to make a Prince of Persia with that subject. And now you're telling the story of Ayyar, so it's growing. So I'm curious, let's go back and see what makes you interested in Persian stories and culture and this part of the world, to the extent that you've been involved with these stories for more than 30 years of your life.
Well, yeah. So going back to, I guess, the 1970s, I was a kid in New York, so I really didn't know anything about Persia. I knew the 1001 Nights. I had seen the movie Thief of Baghdad. This was even before Aladdin. I'm older.
Back in the 30s, right?
Yeah, there was actually a silent film version of Thief of Baghdad with Douglas Fairbanks, and then there was a 1940 Technicolor version, which is the one that I saw. With Conrad Veidt, as the Grand Vizier Jafar. Jafar is such a great character. It's funny, I took his name, for the villain of Prince of Persia, and then Disney took it a couple of years later for the villain in Aladdin. I don't know why Jafar is always the bad vizier. Yeah, so I mean, that was really all I knew. And for the first Prince of Persia game, the graphics were so simple on the Apple II. It was really just a matter of, a few arches and a pillar to kind of suggest Persia. But it wasn't until doing the Sands of Time 15 years later with Patrice and with the team at Ubisoft Montreal that I really sort of sat down to say, okay, this is Prince of Persia. Let's find out what the mythology behind this would be. And so that's when I actually read the Shahnameh for the first time.
Wow.
It's kind of embarrassing, but in making the first version and all the years in between, I'd never read it. And so I sat down and read it, a great illustrated with Persian miniatures. There's the translation by Dick Davis. And so then I read other translations of it as well. And, some, things like the Conference of the Birds.
Wow.
And there's a little bit of that in Sands of Time. I mean, it's it's not, it's, like in some of the dialogues, for example, if you played the game when the prince and Farah are in a library, and he pulls out a book of poetry and reads from it.
Yeah.
It's it's a couple of lines from Rumi that he reads to her, and then and then there's things like where he says if like there's a hint to break down a wall because there's a stronger sword on the other side of it, and he says something in his voiceover like, even if I had the strength of Rustam, I couldn't break down this wall.
Yeah.
So I just use that because I thought, well, what would a 9th century Persian prince, say, if he wanted, to evoke the idea of super strength, he today we'd say, Superman, or, and in Europe they would have said Hercules. So had him say Rustam. So there was that, but that's, but that came later. That was, I didn't know that yet when I made the first Prince of Persia.
Yeah, this is great. Unbelievable that you have read these books and you're familiar with them. And because most of the people, again, mix the Persian literature with Arabian literature, and they're completely different things. And it's very interesting. Are you gonna write something about Shahnameh or a video game about that too? Now that you've mentioned it.
I mean, that's really the myth behind it, right? I mean, to make a kind of an analogy for Western audiences, when I read Samak, I thought, this is kind of like Robin Hood. It's a story that it's kind of, he's a popular character, like we know about him, but we can't always say where we first heard of him. What was it in a story? Was it in a children's book or a TV series? But you can't grow up in the West without hearing of Robin Hood somehow. So I feel like the Shahnameh, it's like, I guess you could say King Arthur, but it's more than that. It's like the origin myth, because all of the characters in Samak they would know the Shahnameh, and those would be their references.
Exactly.
Those ancient heroes or origin stories.
Have you ever been in Middle Eastern? You mentioned that you've never been in Iran. But have you visited the countries around?
Lost audio for a sec. Maybe you could just say that again to make sure.
I said, have you ever visited Middle Eastern countries? And because you mentioned that you were never in Iran.
No, I've never visited Iran. Come close a couple of times, almost had the chance, but the stars never aligned for me to actually go there. Yeah. I've been to Morocco for, most recently for the filming of the Prince of Persia movie.
Yeah.
Which they filmed in Morocco because it has, deserts and mountains.
It's totally different. It's totally different, and I can't
It's totally different.
Yeah,
totally different.
Can't wait to show you around the country. There are places that when you enter, you get this feeling that, wow, I feel this presence of being in a different time period, and it feels so amazing. It's like living in Prince of Persia game. It's like going inside of your own head.
I've traveled there so much in my imagination, and when I met Rasooli and we started to, he was helping with the research, and of course I was watching video after video of the mountains and in Iran and the different landscapes, and he kept telling me, it's such a shame that you filmed the Prince of Persia movie in Morocco. It's nothing like it. So I have an image, but still haven't been there.
Yeah, and Patrice is a history buff too.
For you.
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
Yeah, so I want to ask you, how did Prince of Persia seem to you growing up in Iran? When you heard of the video game and then when you played it, like what?
Oh,
what was your impression of it?
It's a really big thing here. Not only about the fact that it's a very important game, but also even in universities when they teach computer science and courses like that, there are like articles about you and the game. So it's way more than just a video game. It's about history of computer programming, And then there's this aspect of the this guy who made a game about our country, and and he's American, and it's crazy. And again, I was telling my friend that I'm going to have a chat with Jordan, and we're like, oh, this is insane, unbelievable. They had all sort of questions. Why is he interested in this country? To ask him about Prince of Persia, and it's crazy. People are very kind of familiar with your work, with your games throughout the years, and it's very interesting. And it's a cultural thing here. It's way more than a video game. It's about the culture of Iranian culture, Persian culture, traveling around the world, even if it was made by an American, someone outside the country. So for me, it's very, very close to the heart. And the first time I experienced the game, I was born in '91. So first time I experienced the game, I think, was with Prince of Persia: Sands of Time, and I played that and was like, "Oh, this is great! This is awesome!" And people were like, "Did you know that there are like a lot of other games about Prince of Persia before this one?" I was like, "No," and I went to play those games, and it was crazy. And how you could. I was looking at the gameplay of those games just before doing the interview, and I was amazed by how, with those limited sources, you could kind of convey the feeling of being in a different region other than, games back then, like being in Persia, being in a Middle Eastern country. And it's so fascinating to kind of see that. But I had the same question about for you. So it's been more than 30 years since you created Prince of Persia. Looking back at it now, how do you feel, and what that project changed in you that you value the most?
Well, it's funny you should say looking back, because last year, in this in that otherwise strange year of 2020, I also released a book of my old journals from when I was in my 20s, when I was making the first Prince of Persia. I don't know if this has made it to Iran, but this is the making of Prince of Persia journals, and it's and it's not a look back. It's what I actually wrote in my journals at the time. So when I read it, it takes me back, and sometimes I'm like, oh my God, I can't believe, I'm so embarrassed that I said that I wrote it, when I was 20, 22. So of course, that was a long time ago. I feel like I've learned a lot since then, but I also really appreciate that period, and having had having been born in the right time and place, just when video games were kind of starting to become what they were. Until the Apple II computer came along, I wanted to be a cartoonist, and that's what I spent all my time doing. At age 11, 12, 13, I was drawing cartoons and comic books. I thought maybe I could become a Disney animator, do animated films, something like that, or a comic strip. But then when the Apple II came along, I just got addicted to programming, and I didn't want to do anything else. But it's, if I'd been born 5 years earlier or later, it would have been different. The industry would have been in a different place. But so much just depends on accidents. And I think choosing Persia, Prince of Persia as a subject for that 2D running, jumping game that really, at the time, it could have, the graphics were so simple. You say it's just a few pixels that kind of suggest a world. Why that? I think it was destiny. It was just, it seemed like it was a choice that I sort of made in a day, really. Okay, I need a world for this game. What will it be? And then that choice just determined, and so much about the next 30 years. And it's enriched my life in so many ways, with so many encounters and travels that I couldn't have predicted. So, life is like that. I think we really have to embrace the accidents that happen and just let them lead us where they will.
Exactly. As you mentioned, even the fact that it was released on Apple II made the game completely different. I mean, you were talking about the limitation of making Prince of Persia on Apple II, and those limitations kind of ended up being in your advantage. For example, the Shadow Man story. That's crazy. The Shadow Man story is unbelievable to make such a thing back in 1987. So and the source of the reason that Shadow Man exists is because of the limitation of Apple II, and the way you found out about how to kind of create this combat with that limitation. So exactly as you mentioned, 5 years earlier, 5 years later would have changed the course of history.
Shadow Man is a great example. Yeah, even just 1 or 2 years later, I would have been doing the game on the PC, and there would have been enough memory to add lots of different kinds of enemies and monsters. And so I think I naturally would have done that. You know, in a kind of a fantasy universe, of course, the heroes should be fighting different kinds of creatures. It was just on the Apple II, the memory was full. I wanted to add creatures, but I couldn't. So had to dig deeper, and Shadow Man just turned out to be one of my favorite things in the game.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't have thought of that if I hadn't been forced to, if my back hadn't been pushed to the wall by being out of memory.
So people want to know, do you think you ever get a chance to make another Prince of Persia?
Well, never say never. I mean, if you had told me in 1987 that, you know, not only would there be a Prince of Persia 2, but then there would be, the Sands of Time and the new console generation of games, a movie, I would have had a hard time believing that.
Yeah, so it's 2020.
There's something about the story of the universe that, it just keeps coming back in different forms. It's very, I think there's something at the heart of it that's just so appealing that it lends itself very well to being adapted and transformed into the next version.
Yeah, it's 2021. What makes a great Prince of Persia if you were to reboot the franchise this moment?
Well, I think the one thing that I've always wished there was a little more of in the Prince of Persia games was Persia. The culture and the landscape that we were just talking about, it is so unique and really, I think, just scratched the surface, of everything that's there. So to do a game that's really specifically Persian and that draws on, all of that richness, the landscape, the mythology, that's something I would love to see.
Exactly, I would like to see that too. To walk around the city, kind of being in the time, interacting with people. It would be great. It would be great. So you made a Prince of Persia movie in 2010. Are you interested in making another movie? Not just Prince of Persia particularly, but any movie?
Yeah, I mean, I've written screenplays for various projects. That Prince of Persia movie from Disney and Bruckheimer is the only one that's been out on the big screen. I mean, I made a short documentary that you can see on public TV and YouTube. But as far as theatrical features, not just Prince of Persia so far. I'm working now a lot in the graphic novel arena, writing stories as graphic novels.
Wow!
And that's
are you writing Prince of Persia graphic novel?
At the moment, I'm writing an original story.
Wow.
Which it's a little early to talk about it, but this time next year I'll have a lot to talk about. And I did one a few years ago about the Knights Templar in the 14th century.
Yeah. Wow.
Which I love historical research too, and especially when history kind of intersects with myth and legend to create a kind of a fantasy adventure feeling. I love that kind of story as a kid, and I still do. So Templar was a great project, and the one I'm doing now with a great artist is, it also has, well, I won't say any more about it, but yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, so
all of these media.
I'm a huge fan of Assassin's Creed series. I'm curious, what do you think about those games?
Hmm. Well, you talked to Patrice, so you know that Assassin's Creed began as Prince of Persia.
Yeah.
Patrice and I were part of the team at Montreal that made Sands of Time in 2003. And then the idea was to go on and do a next-gen sequel to Prince of Persia with that team. So originally that was Prince of Persia Assassin.
Yeah.
And and then the story of Samarkand that you mentioned, that was part of the research for that. And just as that project evolved, it sort of got more historical and less fantasy. And then there was a moment when, as I'm sure Patrice told you, when it stopped being Prince of Persia and became Assassin's Creed. So I wasn't involved in it, from that moment on.
Do you still play video games, by the way?
Yeah, the last game that really gripped me, that I just got completely addicted to, was Zelda Breath of the Wild.
Wow, yeah.
On the Switch a couple of years ago. That's just, that really, I play all kinds of games, for research, but personally, as far as my taste as a gamer, Zelda Breath of the Wild really hit my sweet spot.
One thing that
it's simple, it's beautiful.
One thing that I noticed about you is that you like adventure, and even in the book, it's obvious what you like about that book, about not knowing the future, but going through it through an adventure. And another thing is that you like princes. You mentioned Zelda again, and Assassin's Creed, and in Samak there is a princess. I mean, you could have named Samak the Ayyar. You could have named it Prince of Persia, Samak the Ayyar, and nothing would be wrong with that. That's exactly.
It's funny because the main character of Samak the Ayyar is not the prince, but Samak, who's sort of a hero of the common people. He has the nobility of spirit. He has the abilities to climb walls and to do all sorts of clever things, like a ninja. But he's protecting the prince. He's helping him, and that was actually the completely by coincidence. That was the idea that Patrice mentioned, going from Prince of Persia Sands of Time to Prince of Persia Assassin. The idea that what if in the next game, instead of playing the prince, you play the bodyguard, the guy who's trying to help and protect the prince. And that's kind of the setup of Samak the Ayyar, which was told 1,000 years before. So
yeah, exactly. So Jordan, I'm a video game composer and sound designer. Looking back at the very first Prince of Persia, I found it genius regarding music and sound. The limitations you had and the way you guys created and used audio is still a master class. So simple, but yet it connects and adds another layer to the game. What suggestions do you have for me regarding the use of music and audio in games?
Well, I mean, as you know, music and audio are so powerful and an often underrated, part of movies and TV as well, but certainly of games. I can't talk about the audio for Prince of Persia without mentioning my dad, who composed the music for Prince of Persia and my game before that, Karateka. Yep. Yeah, and this was on the Apple II. So you have to understand that you probably played the PC version of Prince of Persia, the first 2D game I'm going to get. So there, at least, it was music with, proper sound effects. But on the Apple II, it was really just beeps and buzzes played through the Apple's built-in computer. And so my dad, who's a, classical pianist from Vienna, who was born in Vienna, Austria, in 1931. So he sat down at the piano and played some themes. And he said, I think we should use a leitmotif approach for the music. That is, have one theme for the hero, one for the princess, a love theme, a theme for the villain, and so sort of basing this on, Wagner's Ring of the Nibelung is a great example. but this leitmotif approach was also used in films like Star Wars and Indiana Jones. Hollywood's used it, forever. He came up with musical motifs, which I then translated into the Apple II's tinny speaker. But even so, it was such an important part of the game. And then of course, in subsequent games, we had real music, and trained composers who have done. The scores for the various Prince of Persia games over the years really contain some wonderful music. In the movie too, it's and that's always like an especially exciting moment for me on any project. To hear the music, because it's kind of like magic, because you choose someone, you trust them to create the music for this thing that everyone's been working so hard on, and you sort of have. I sort of have an idea in my mind that's at the same time very, very specific as to what I hope to hear, but also I have absolutely no idea what it's going to be. So then when the composer comes in and says, all right, here's a main theme, it's just magic. I can't say it any other way.
But when you were writing the book, did you have any kind of Iranian music playing in the background?
Oh yeah, all the time. I had a playlist.
Wow,
I recently put together a number of playlists. Yeah, it was. I'm thinking. You bring to mind also The Last Express, which was the first game I did where I collaborated with a film composer, Elliot Smiral. He's a great Czech composer who had done the score for Ronin, and he recorded Last Express with an orchestra with a real violin, and so that was I think that was sort of the moment when video game music kind of went from the its early stages of the 80s and 90s into the today. Video game music is it's an entire universe.
Exactly. Yeah. So, last question for you. What advice do you have for newcomers of the video game industry and those who make indie games?
I think the one thing that I wish that, people did tell me this when I was in my 20s, and I heard it, but I wish I had heard it even more, is to really be open and be grateful for the people that come into your path. I think so often, especially for people who are ambitious and creative, it's like we sort of get fixated on, we want a certain outcome, we want things to go a certain way, or we see ourselves doing a certain job. And sometimes it works out that way, and sometimes it goes a different way. And it's a shame to miss opportunities because it's not exactly what we envisioned. Sometimes we meet someone and that changes everything. We have the chance to collaborate with someone on a project where, it's not, for example, you mentioned indie games. Some people are like, I want to do AAA games, or I want to be a creative director on a AAA game or whatever. Great. But if you have a chance to take a role team in a different kind of game and the people are great, it's like that can be the greatest thing that ever happened. It could also be a disaster, you never know. But only by being open and really appreciating the things that actually happen, can we discover what might happen. So that's sounds a bit vague maybe, but that's my advice, to just really be open and appreciate the opportunities that come our way without being too quick to judge or dismiss things just because they don't match our preconceptions in some way.
Exactly. That's a great advice. And thank you so much, Jordan. Your life and career is a true inspiration for those who dream. Your new book is a beautiful story about love, friendship, and adventures. I love it. I love your work, and I love you. And it's been an absolute honor to talk to you, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. And I'm so glad that you read and enjoyed Samak the Ayyar. I hope your viewers will discover it too.
Thank you. Yeah.